Hi and welcome back. This is Mang from Design Plus Code. Now we're going to discuss about how to make the layout a little bit more adaptive and how to use CSS grid, which is super important to divide your layout into multiple columns and multiple rows. So CSS grid is super powerful, is even more powerful than Flexbox for those who are familiar with it. And it gives you a lot more flexibility, and you can use new CSS commands such as repeat, or you can use the fraction unit. It's really useful. I'm going to show you very soon how to apply it to your website. So let's get started. Now let's bring back the header that we removed earlier. First of all, the header is inside the components folder, and again, components is what is going to allow us to set up elements in which we can reuse multiple times across the lifetime of our interface as well as our app. So we're going to click on the header.js, and here you can see that it's a very basic component, starting with importing React, and then the Gatsby link component that we use in order to link from one page to another and cache everything. It's really cool. And then we export it as a component called header. Now, what is inside here is in HTML. And as I mentioned, React used this language called JSX, which is a mix of HTML and JavaScript. And that's why we can see, really familiar HTML tags. And along with it, we have these JavaScript. First of all, I like to start from scratch. And what I'm going to do here is to remove all of these inline styling that I really dislike. So I'm going to delete the entire thing. And whenever you create a component, make sure you always have a beginning and closing tag. So for example, it has to have div and then closing div. If you do that, then you won't have an error anymore. And just to make sure that our header is going to have some content, I'm going to write header and save. Now, as you can see, the header doesn't appear anywhere. So that's because we need to import it back to our template. Remember here, we deleted here at line 16 or 17. We're gonna bring it back. So header, and then if you don't want to write, another tag, a closing tag / header, then you can just have a single tag and then end it with a slash at the end. And this is the equivalent of having those two tags, beginning and closing tags. So as you can see, when we include this here, it automatically shows the header. So that works. Now we're gonna head back to header.js, and we're gonna start bringing content to our header. Now let's plan our structure. So let's go back to the design. And what we're seeing here is that this is our component header. And it's not taking the full width. And the other thing I want to say is that we might want to have another group inside the header component so that we can center this group of elements. And then we have the flexibility to have the full width with a background if, for example, the user navigates more towards the bottom and we want to have a fixed header that is readable on top. So we're gonna set our HTML structure like that. First of all, the first div is gonna have a class name of header, and then we're gonna write a second div with a class name of header group. So we're gonna bring each of these elements as an HTML. First of all, we need a link. And that's why we have the Gatsby link. So we're gonna need this with the property called to, and this is gonna go to the URL. And this is where we're gonna put the image. So image, src, and then we're gonna have a width of 30, and we're gonna close the image tag. The src, the source file, we're gonna take care of it later, but for now we're gonna have this. And then the next is link to courses. And when we save, we can already see that the link is appearing, but the image is not, because the image doesn't have a source. Now I want to show you a really nice trick in Visual Studio. So you can press Shift, Option, and down arrow to duplicate many times. So we're gonna have downloads, and then we're gonna have workshops. We're gonna have buy. But the buy is gonna be a button. So we're gonna enclose that inside a button tag. And now it should look like this. Now let's talk about the image element. Usually you only need to do that in the CSS and you reference that, and it's pretty straightforward. It gives to the folder using dot dot and the folders. But when you do it in GSX, you actually need to import the image. So for example, import logo from, again, using the same thing, such as going to the image and then let's say logo dash design code dot svg, and then you would replace that for the source property, so logo, like this, and it's gonna work. Now when you have so many images in your page, for example, you might have 20 images, and as you can imagine, you can have a lot of import coding to do. So what I like to do is, instead of doing this, I'm just gonna replace this value by require and then single quotes and using the same technique. So logo dash design code dot svg, and now it's gonna work exactly the same. I'm gonna enable again the word wrapping. And if it's an image that exists in the cloud, it's even simpler. You just need to set the link by doing a very simple double quote and then the link to your image. But because we have it locally, we're gonna keep it like this. Okay, so with every component, you should have a CSS file that accompany it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna right click on component. We're gonna click on new file. I'm gonna name it header.css with a capital H. And by the way, this is my own naming convention. When it's a component, I like to start with a H capital, or like the first letter is a capital. But I see they already have, header.js without a capital, and I'm just gonna leave it like this. And now we're gonna start styling the header using the same class names that we have set previously. So dot header and then curly brackets. So we want our header to float on top of the background and these title elements. We're gonna use something called position fixed, and we're gonna save. Now what you're noticing is that it's not doing anything. It should be floating, but it's not doing anything. That's because we haven't imported the CSS file. So we're gonna go back to the header.js and we're gonna import the CSS file by doing dot and then slash header.css. And if you save, you see that it starts to apply the style. And this is how you would import a CSS file into your JavaScript. Now let's go back to the CSS file. And because it's a position fix, we need to set the width to 100%. And we also want to have some padding. So 50 pixels from the top, 0 for the right and left. And then we want to set the Z index to 100. Now why the Z index? That's because we always want our header to be on top of everything. Because as soon as you start using position fix or absolute, sometimes when you have multiple of them, some of them might be on top, or they might even be hidden by others. So that's why you have this hierarchy in which you can set a number, and you want to set a high number for something that you know is always going to be on top of everything else, and you want to set a low number, let's say 1 or 0, for something that's going to be at the base. What I want to say also is that yes, we haven't really centered this, but we set a padding, and the reason why we're doing this is because, you know, as soon as we start scrolling, you can't see it right now, but let me set the inspect so that I can start scrolling. You can see that the header is actually fixed, and sometimes the color is not too readable. So what I'm gonna do later, and this is just, you don't need to follow me on this, I'm gonna set a black background. As you can see, the black background is gonna appear when we start scrolling, but we're gonna learn that later. But that's why I set up this structure right now. Okay, we're gonna set the header group, so that we can start aligning our elements. The first thing is we want our header to be about 800 in terms of width. So we're gonna set the max width to 800 and margin to 0 auto so that it centers. But what you're noticing here is that the links are just piling up and they're not really taking the full space of our 800 pixels. So we're gonna start using the grid by doing display grid, and by default is gonna, you know, pile things using rows instead. So what I want to do instead of doing that is to use grid template columns, and I'm gonna set repeat 5, because I have 5 elements, to a unit of auto. And now what this means is that it's gonna take the full 800 and it's gonna divide it by 5 using a width that is automatic, meaning that if there's more text, it's gonna take more space. If there's less text, it's gonna take less space. It's gonna try to distribute the remaining space in a consistent fashion. Now, I just want to say the repeat thing is super cool, but writing this repeat thing is the equivalent of saying auto, 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 auto 5 times. So each of these auto will apply to each of these elements. And if you write it 4 times, it's just gonna go to the second row, right? So that's why you would write it 5 times. But instead of writing this, a cleaner way is to do it 5 auto. And another problem that we have here is that it's not really centering the elements properly. If you inspect this thing, you can see that there's a box, but the logo is at the very left and top, and we don't really want that. So we're gonna do something like align items center. So first of all, align is gonna allow us to align vertically, and then we can also do something like justify items center. And this is going to allow us to align all the elements horizontally in the center. So align is for vertical, and justify is for horizontal. Now let me show you the power of CSS grid. First of all, we have max width, which means that if it's more than 800 pixel, it's just gonna stay at 800 pixel. But if it's less than 800 pixel, it's gonna adapt, meaning that it's gonna take the full width of the screen. But with the power of CSS grid, you can see that I'm using auto, and auto allows me to have automatic sizing so that it uses the remaining space between the elements smartly. So you can see that it does a really good job at stacking all the elements together against a smaller screen. So that's super useful. Now we're ready to style the links. Header A, and then we're gonna set the color to white, just like in the design. And the font weight, it's gonna be a little bit bolder by using 700. And finally, we're gonna style the button right here. So header button, and we're gonna set it to a padding of 8 pixel, 20 pixel. So 8 from the top, and then 20 left and right. And then the font size is gonna be 20 pixel. Already we are seeing some results. We're gonna set the background to the color in our design here. So we're gonna use this color code. And because it's a button, it has some default borders. We're gonna set the border to none. The font weight to 700 to bold. And we also want to have some border radius to 10 pixel. Another thing I want to mention is that by default, when you start clicking on it, you can see that we already have some issue with the outline. It has some weird glow going on. So in order to fix this is to simply do outline none. Also by default, if you don't have a link set properly, you see that there's no cursor. So you might want to add cursor pointer. So in which case, when you mouse over, you're going to see your cursor and it looks much more like a button. Now let's talk about adaptive layouts, because that's a really hot topic. As you know, we're designing for so many devices nowadays, and we have to, be diligent about this. So when I resize this, you can see that, there are too many elements here. What we want to do is perhaps to hide some elements when the screen is smaller, so that we only see a couple of links instead of having all 5 links. So let's do that. We're gonna use media query, media, and if the layout is less than 600 pixel, then we're gonna apply these styles. So that means that whenever there's a max width of 640 pixels or less, then we're gonna apply these styles, starting with the header. So header, the padding is gonna be 15 pixel to 0. So already we're getting rid of some of the extra space at the top when the screen is less than 640 pixels. We're also gonna change our CSS grid. So using the header group, we're gonna set the grid template columns to repeat 4 columns instead. Now the problem, of course, is that we have the 5th one that goes on the 2nd row, and that's exactly what we don't want. So what we're gonna do instead is to hide one of the columns. So in order to do that, we're gonna do header, and we're gonna select the link, which is A, and then column, NTH, for selecting which of these columns. And we're gonna select the 4th one and set it to display none. Boom, as you can see, we have hidden the 4th column. So now we only have 4 columns and our layout is looking a little bit better. We can of course decide to add more conditions and more like max width properties, but for the simplicity of this course, I'm gonna limit to just this. So we are hiding the 4th column if the width of the device is 640 or less. Now let's test it. As you can see, it's working pretty good. And while we're on the topic of adaptive layouts, one of the things that is really common to do is that when the device is really small, you want the fonts to be smaller as well. And because we're also pushing the header a little bit further up, we might want to push the content further up a little bit too. So let's head to index.css, and we're going to change some properties inside our hero elements. So let's create media max width 640, and we're gonna change the hero group to a padding of 100 pixel and 20 from the sides instead. So when I resize, you can see that it's not taking as much space from the top. We're also going to change the hero H1, which is the big title, to font size 40 instead of 60. And then we're going to change also the paragraph to font size 24. And now it looks much more like what a site on a mobile should look like. Alright, so we've learned some really cool technique today. We've learned about CSS Grid, which is really awesome. I can't stress enough how much I love CSS Grid and how much I can do with it and how flexible my layout can become because of CSS Grid. So learning this is so powerful to creating your own design, applying any kind of layout that you want, a table style, a list style, a grid style, anything that you want, and making it super adaptive and flexible. We've learned about media queries, which is super important for changing the different font size or the paddings and spacing and properties depending on the size of the device. And so you can use these techniques to bring to life your own design. And please don't forget to share it on Twitter. I would love to retweet it. Share what you love about this course and what you don't like about this course. I would love to get your feedback. So I'll see you on the next course where we're going to learn about interactions, animations, and some really cool new techniques along the way.